Welcome to everyone. Happy Tuesday. We have a lot to cover this afternoon. As I'm sure many of you are aware, the state released some new isolation and quarantine guidance on Friday. So we are going to spend the majority of the webinar discussing that guidance. But to kick us off, we have my colleague, Colin Carr. Colin is a litigation attorney here in our Syracuse office, and he is going to give us an update on what is going on with New York's eviction moratorium. So Colin, welcome and take it away.
Thank you, Adam. So big news, New York State's eviction moratorium has finally expired on last Saturday, January 15th. And it's big news because New York State has the highest share of renters in the United States. Approximately 591,000 renters are behind in rent in New York State. This moratorium ended up being the second longest statewide moratorium in the United States, second only behind New Mexico. So prior to Saturday, the legal landscape looked very different in New York. If you were a landlord and you tried to evict a tenant, and that tenant submitted a completed COVID-19 hardship declaration form, you could not proceed with your eviction until at least January 15th, 2022. Initially, under the law, the submission of this hardship declaration form served as conclusive proof that the tenant suffered an economic hardship because of the pandemic. Now, the Supreme Court of the United States found that portion of the law problematic, the conclusive effect of the hardship form, because it violated or it infringed on the due process rights of landlords and their ability to contest whether or not the tenant actually did suffer from a hardship. So New York State had to modify the law, and under the modification, landlords had the opportunity during a hearing to really contest whether there was a hardship. And the grounds for overcoming this form were still very limited, however. The landlord could either just contest whether or not the hardship existed, or the landlord could try to demonstrate that the tenant was intentionally damaging the apartment, the unit they're living in, or whether their actions were recklessly, interfering with the use and enjoyment of other tenants in the building. And so there were really just two limited grounds for overcoming a hardship declaration form. And many landlords weren't able to obtain the relief they sought under these narrow confines of these grounds. And they resorted to trying to fit their arguments within the confines. But that was the state of the law last week, and pretty much over the past 2 years. Now the state of the law is very different. Evictions can proceed even if there was a COVID hardship declaration form submitted by the tenant. If you initiated a hearing for eviction, sorry about that. If you initiated commenced a hearing for eviction, and a tenant did submit this hardship declaration form, you likely received a tentative adjourned date for today, January 18th, which is the first business day following the statewide eviction moratorium of January 15th, the end date of it. But that was a tentative date. The court's going to contact you if your case is going to proceed. It will contact you with an actual date to schedule your eviction hearing. I believe that these are going to be scheduled chronologically. So those of you who submitted your hardship or who commenced your eviction petition earlier on, you likely will receive an actual date first, and it'll work chronologically throughout that. And if you don't hear anything in the coming days from a tenant, from the court, you're recommended to contact the court clerk, and try to figure out exactly when your actual date will be. And that'll just get worked out through the courts and in the coming days. Some things to keep in mind looking forward. The state legislature, the past 2 years, has tried to enact good cause eviction requirements. And these would serve pretty much the same function as the moratorium did, in that landlords would be strictly limited in their ability to evict. The reasons that they would be able to evict, would be limited to certain grounds. And those efforts failed the past 2 years, but it's likely that the state legislature will attempt to try to get those enacted into law again this coming year. The new governor, Governor Hochul, has not indicated her position on these laws. She's been silent as to it. So it's unclear whether or not, even if the state legislature did pass them, whether or not she would actually sign it into law. But obviously there's more pressure and focus on New York State and its landlord tenant laws now that this eviction moratorium has expired. So it's very likely that she will face pressure from the more progressive caucus of the state legislature to try to get these good cause eviction requirements enacted. And that's something that we'll be closely watching throughout the new year and update accordingly. So that's the status of New York State's eviction moratorium. And that's all I have for right now.
Colin, thank you. So just to follow up, if somebody filed an eviction petition before and were given a temporary return date of today, they should just be on the lookout from the court for a new return date. And if they don't get one, they need to contact the court. Is that right?
Right. I had a pending case, and last Friday I was concerned because I had the tentative date of today, and I had to know whether or not I should appear for it. So I called the court, and they informed me that they're working through it chronologically. They're reaching out, they're calling those who have appeared to inform them of their new date, their actual date. Again, the 18th was just a tentative date that they were giving. It was the first business day following January 15th. So it's just the date they gave everyone. And obviously they can't accommodate everyone on today. And so they informed me that mine likely would be early February, but I haven't gotten that formal notification yet. And so they're working through it, they're processing it. But it wouldn't hurt to call if you don't hear anything in the coming days, just to confirm and check in on the status of your case.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Colin. Really appreciate it. If anybody has any questions about evictions or commencing an eviction proceeding, please feel free to reach out to Colin directly and he will help you out.
Thanks, Adam.
Thank you, Colin. Okay, next up, good friend of mine, Pete Jones, is returning to the program to walk through this updated New York quarantine and isolation guidance that we all got at the end of last week. So Pete, welcome. Thank you for joining us. I am going to get us started with talking about the different types of quarantine and isolation requirements that are out there right now. So first of all, you have the federal government that has CDC guidance, and as I like to do, these links are hyperlinked. So tomorrow or whenever, when you go to our website and you download the PowerPoint presentation, you should be able to access these hyperlinked documents throughout the presentation. So first of all, we have the CDC guidance. Reminder to everybody that this is just guidance. These aren't rules. There is no enforceability of these rules. So, they're more of a guide for both us and for the state. More importantly, we have the New York State Department of Health guidance documents. These are authoritative here and what most of you should be focused on. So what we got on Friday includes an isolation and quarantine guidance document that supersedes what the state had previously put out on January 4th. So I've hyperlinked to the January 14th document. I would also note that the state's COVID isolation and quarantine webpage has been updated significantly, and it now includes a number of guidance documents that we're going to talk through. They're all put in that one place. So the state not only has this general population guidance, but it also has specific guidance for schools and for healthcare workers. The school and healthcare worker guidance was issued before January 14th, but it remains in place. Again, I've hyperlinked to those documents there as well. In addition to the federal CDC recommendations, the state applicable guidance documents, many local health authorities have also put out their own guidance documents. For example, Onondaga County has put out a very specific guidance document. Erie County also has a website where they have isolation and guidance. If you're in a county that's different from Onondaga or Erie, I would suggest that you also check your county website to determine if there is specific local health authority guidance that would be applicable to you. Some counties are more helpful than others. I will point that out. Onondaga County has a number of resources which are very helpful. Some counties do not, some smaller counties do not. They don't have the resources to have those types of guidance documents published. So just check with your local health department or your local county website. Okay, so let's talk about this new document that we got on January 14th. I think a big takeaway is that New York State has given local health departments the ability to suspend contact tracing. For the past almost 2 years, from March of 2020, we've relied on local health departments to take in information about positive tests, to then engage contact tracers and determine who may have had close contact with a positive case, to issue quarantine and isolation orders. That seems to be coming to an end. If any of you have seen quarantine or isolation orders from the past 2 years, you know they're very formal documents. I remember very early on, our family had a quarantine order provided to our house. It was served by a county sheriff, very formal document. That process seems to be gone. A couple of takeaways from this new guidance is that you should not expect a call from the local health department or a quarantine or isolation order. Many local health departments and now the state are utilizing self-attestation forms that individuals can fill out saying they meet the criteria for an isolation or quarantine order. These are no longer the formal documents that you've been seeing in the past from local health authorities. The onus is really starting to be placed on individuals and businesses, and I can add schools in there as well. All right, just very quickly, what is isolation and what is quarantine? These terms are thrown around a lot, and I just want to make sure that we have a good understanding of what each one means. Essentially, they require the same actions, but they follow or flow from different events. So isolation is following a positive test. So you test positive, you have to isolate. Somebody tests positive, they have to isolate. It means practically separation from those without COVID-19. If you live in a house, it means you are isolated in a particular area. Local health departments have been advising that this requires also use of a separate bathroom if possible. Quarantine follows from an exposure. So isolation flows from a positive test. Quarantine follows from an exposure. Practically speaking, isolation and quarantine require the same thing. You separate from others. You use a separate space if you're in a household, if that's possible. The only difference, practically speaking, in a quarantine is that you also have to monitor for symptoms. So if you've tested positive, you know you have COVID-19. If you've had close contact, you don't necessarily know you have COVID-19. You might not be symptomatic, so you have to monitor for symptoms. All right. So with that, I am going to turn it over, or no, I am handling this one. Sorry, Pete. If we think about quarantine and isolation in categories, there's really 3 categories you have to think about. One is anyone who is symptomatic for the virus, whether they've been exposed or not. So you have one of the symptoms of COVID that are listed in the CDC symptom list. Another type is, or another situation would be those who are positive for COVID. So those who are symptomatic, scenario 1, those who are positive, scenario 2. Scenario 3 would be those who have had a close contact. And there are different steps that you take based upon each of those classifications, which we're going to get into later. So first of all, we're going to run through the nuts and bolts of what the guidance says to do in each of those situations. So if somebody is symptomatic, according to that new guidance, that means they're experiencing one or more symptoms, and I've linked to the CDC symptom list there. You are supposed to stay home, separate from other people, monitor symptoms, and get tested. You are supposed to isolate while you're waiting for test results. And according to this guidance, you're supposed to isolate even if you don't have a known close contact with a positive case. So this places a significant burden on individuals because, again, there's going to be no quarantine or isolation order in place if you're just symptomatic. but this is what the guidance is telling you you should do. So this is what to do if you're symptomatic, and I'm going to turn it over to Pete for the next category.
Thanks, Adam. It's good to be back with everybody here. I have a couple of just general comments, and we'll weave it in as we go. But one is we do know this is challenging and perhaps frustrating. To add to the frustration of dealing with a pandemic, you have the added frustration of having to deal with ever-changing guidance. I mean, I feel like the word guidance is almost starting to become, a bit of a dirty word in some ways. That there's guidance on everything, and the guidance is ever-changing. So I think our broad overall advice is that you have to, whenever you get one of these situations, apply the guidance that is in place at the time. That's going to require some of us to forget things that we've learned, or at least unlearn them, or be flexible about how we apply them. So as Adam has said, there really are three different possibilities here. One is that you're symptomatic, but you don't know that you've been exposed to anybody, and you haven't tested positive yet. So you might have some sort of respiratory condition, you might have the flu, or you might have COVID. So that's the first situation that Adam just referred to. The second situation is when in fact you are positive, because you've got a test result that indicates that you have the virus. Okay. And so this guidance has changed, and it really follows the lead of the CDC, but this guidance has changed the isolation period. So if you have a positive test, but you are asymptomatic, that is, you're not experiencing symptoms, you need to isolate for 5 days. And the guidance defines day 0 as the day of the positive test. That's the day when you took the test, not the day you got the result. And day 1 is going to be the first full day after the collection of that specimen. And so that's how we do the counting to get to the 5 days. Assuming that you don't become symptomatic at the end of that 5-day period, you can break the isolation, but you're supposed to continue to wear a well-fitting mask for up to the 10-day mark. CDC Director Michelle Walensky explained this, that 85%, I think she said, of the transmission occurs in the first 5 days. And their hope is that the mask wearing for the additional 5 days will catch the remaining 15%. If you're unable to wear a well-fitting mask, then you should continue to isolate for the entire 10 days. If symptoms develop, we start over because you're no longer asymptomatic. And we'll talk about that in just a second in terms of positive and symptomatic. You're supposed to avoid travel for 10 days. And testing is not required to end the isolation. And again, I think the CDC said that's because testing was designed to detect whether you have the virus or not designed to measure transmissibility. Some people had speculated it's because there was an availability of testing issue, and that may have been a practical issue that the CDC was faced with, but the science, at least according to the CDC, which it looks like New York State has followed along with, is that the tests weren't designed to detect levels at which the virus is transmissible. So if you test positive, your isolation can end. If you're symptomatic but not hospitalized, okay, so now you tested positive, but you're symptomatic, but you're not hospitalized. We'll cover that in just a second. Your isolation can end after 5 days if you're fever-free for 24 hours without the use of fever-reducing medication, and your symptoms are resolving. And there's some special discussion about the loss of taste and smell, because that can linger for so long. That's not one of the symptoms that has to be resolving. That's accepted from the list. You're supposed to continue to wear your well-fitting mask, again, for the 10-day period. If you're not able to wear the mask, then then you must continue the isolation. And if the fever continues or symptoms are not resolving, then you have to continue until you're fever free for 24 hours. So we're extending that 5-day period. And again, the same travel and testing conditions as the previous slide.
Pete, before you move on, I just want to make one point on this slide. With respect to this fourth bullet, if fever continues or symptoms not resolving after 5 days, that can impact the COVID paid leave that you have to provide. The guidance does not address COVID paid leave specifically, but if an individual or an employee cannot come off of quarantine because their symptoms are not resolving, that may implicate whether you have to continue to pay them COVID leave. So just wanted to point that out.
It's a good point, Adam. And as we proceed to the next slide, I mean, I did see a question in the chat that talked a little bit about, is that still in effect? Of course, the answer to that is yes. And we continue to encounter, I think, difficult situations from a fact-specific perspective on, how to administer that and so on and so forth. So this guidance now that has sort of different periods, and it will necessarily create some issues in how you interpret that, and including the possibility, that someone who's got symptoms but no positive test, would not necessarily be entitled to the COVID pay, or if they haven't been exposed, and so then you may have retroactive application. There's a lot of different permutations. So, okay, so moving forward here, I did mention that there's a special situation if you've been hospitalized and or immunocompromised. And, again, if you're positive and symptomatic and one of those two things, hospitalized or immunocompromised, then you may end up be isolating for longer than that period of time, 10 to 20 days. The guidance talks about consulting with a healthcare provider after ending the isolation, and the possibility that testing might be used to determine when you can be around others. Now, of course, that flies in the face of what I just said. The CDC had said previously about testing. And I think there are some experts who may be on New York State side of this issue who say that we ought to be testing before we end these quarantines and isolation. But in any event, it's a little bit different situation if you're symptomatic and you've been hospitalized or you are immunocompromised. So I think, Adam, we're going to go back to you on this one.
Yes, and I have to take myself off of mute. Thanks, Pete. So we covered what the scenario where someone is symptomatic but hasn't tested positive. We've covered the various scenarios where someone tests positive. Now we're going to cover what the guidance says about what to do if someone is a close contact of a positive case. And just by way of review, a close contact is someone who, within the 48 hours before someone becomes symptomatic or tests positive, you have contact within 6 feet for a total of 15 minutes or more over a 24-hour period. So what to do if you're a close contact? The guidance says, here is who does not have to quarantine if they fall within that definition of close contact. Anyone 12 or older who is fully vaccinated and boosted, if eligible. So the state is putting boosters, or is making whether or not you have had a booster a relevant factor in determining whether or not you have to quarantine following a close contact. If you're over 12, if you're me and I'm fully vaccinated and I'm eligible for a booster, but I didn't get a booster yet, then I have to quarantine following a close contact. However, if I am fully vaccinated, I'm eligible for a booster and I'm boosted, I don't have to quarantine following a close contact. The guidance also says anyone who is ages 5 to 11 who is fully vaccinated does not have to quarantine following a close contact, whether boosted or not, because those children are not able to get booster shots yet. Similarly, anyone who has had a confirmed positive within 90 days with a viral test does not have to quarantine following a close contact. Even though the guidance says you don't have to quarantine, these individuals do or are recommended to do certain things. So here's what they're recommended to do. Number one, get tested 5 days after your close contact, monitor your symptoms. And if you become symptomatic, then you have to get tested. The guidance also clarifies that anyone who has confirmed COVID within 90 days does not have to get tested if they remain asymptomatic. And this goes back to Pete's point from just a moment ago about why the CDC doesn't recommend subsequent testing after a first initial positive test. All right, so that's who does not have to quarantine following a close contact. Now let's talk about who does have to quarantine following a close contact. So that's anyone 12 or older who's fully vaccinated but not yet boosted if eligible. Remember, you're not eligible for a booster for a number of months after your shot, depending on which shot you got. So you might not be yet eligible to be boosted, even though you're over 12. So keep that in mind. Anyone who has not completed a vaccination series. So if you're doing the Moderna vaccine, you got the first shot, but you still haven't received the second shot, or you're not 14 days after your second shot, then you have not completed a vaccination series. And obviously anyone who is not vaccinated. Okay, so what to do during quarantine? You have to stay at home and away from others, to wear a mask around others, monitor your symptoms, get tested after day 5. Now, when can quarantine end for close contacts? 5 days after the last close contact, if no symptoms develop. I would note that the guidance makes an exception or provides a little different recommendation for children under 2 and those who cannot wear a well-fitting mask. They are supposed to quarantine for 10 full days. So they don't get the benefit of that shortened 5-day quarantine period. There is also an exception, a quarantine exception for schools. If students, staff, or teachers are fully vaccinated, that's important, and they're exposed, and they have to quarantine outside of school because they're not boosted, they can attend school when social distancing and masking is monitored and enforced. So there's this little carve out for schools that are important, that's important to know. Those individuals must quarantine outside of schools and they cannot engage in extracurricular activities. Okay.
So Adam,
yeah, go ahead, Pete.
well, I was just going to say, I mean, as I'm listening to us, I'm thinking, man, this is complicated, right? And in one sense it is. It's, you're, if this, but not that, and, carry the one and, add the two and all the rest of it. On the other hand, it is in some sense, a mechanical exercise that you can follow. And we're going to talk in a second about some of the flow charts and the tables. Or if you're a textual person, you can go to the actual guidance. But you just need to find the category that fits, and then follow those rules. In terms of what's actually going on, it seems to me as a layperson, not a public health expert or a medical expert, that it takes me back to Governor Cuomo's initial addresses about opening the pipeline or closing the pipeline. I mean, I think everyone's just kind of tweaking the system to hopefully find a sweet spot of protection and functionality. And I suspect we're going to see more of this, that this will not be the last time we talk about this. May not be the last time this week we talk about this. There could be new guidance, any day that tweaks it even further. But so we'll keep on it for you, and we're here to help you. But it's also just an exercise that needs to be undertaken each time it arises with, based on whatever's applicable at the time.
And Pete, just to your point, we're going to talk about this in just a second, but those flow charts and tables that are out there are very helpful, and I would highly recommend them. Agree.
So, and here's an example. This slide, I think, is an example of, again, the sort of tweaking or, trying to strike the right balance. So there is a recognition that congregate settings and certain special settings are more challenging in terms of transmission. And so the shortened quarantine and isolation does not apply to correctional facilities and detention facilities and homeless shelters, cruise ships, adult care facilities, et cetera, et cetera. So, those are going to continue to follow the 10-day rule. And again, I think the thinking there is just that the environment is more challenging and therefore the risk is higher and therefore the rules will be different. Okay, so, decision-making flow charts and tables. Yeah, and again, somebody has said in the chat that the links are a little bit challenging. These are all live links, and when our presentation goes up, you'll be able to click on these, and they should work. Frankly, I use this presentation to click on it myself, so I think they should be fine. But there is a very useful flow chart that Onondaga County has produced for us. It includes what happens if you're a close contact with a positive, and what if you're tested positive. What's not on there then would be the third case we've talked about today, which is if you have symptoms, but you don't know that you've been in contact with someone who's positive and you haven't tested positive. So there is the third scenario that's not detailed there, but it's a very useful chart. It's in fact a flow chart. So it kind of has the boxes and the lines and everything else. It's a useful document. The state has put out a table that, again, has the various categories in rows and columns, and, will help you work through it. Some of you may be textual people who like to read as opposed to the tables or the flow charts. And then you'd probably want to look at the actual guidance document because it's there, or frankly, this PowerPoint, because Adam broke it all down here into various categories. It all comes right out of the guidance document itself. So there's some different tools. And of course, we're there to help you as well as you work through it, or you have the tough cases that aren't detailed on the charts. Okay. Contact tracing. Adam mentioned this before, and I think we've moved into a new period here where you're not likely to get contacted by your local Department of Health. That may go back as the wave subsides, but for right now, there's a recognition that that people are going to do their own contact tracing, individuals, potentially employers or schools, and that you may get some information. You're probably going to get general information. It's probably going to be imperfect, but contact tracing has moved to a new phase here where it's not going to be done by government agencies. At least there's no commitment that it's going to be done, and I think that's just a resource allocation issue. So the close contact definition: within 6 feet for 15 minutes over a 24-hour period, within 2 days before symptom onset, or positive test if asymptomatic. There is a special rule for schools where the students wear their masks correctly. It allows, in some cases, for students to be within 3 feet of them, I think it says 3 to 6 feet, and allows, a little bit different rule there in recognition that the school setting's a little bit different. Okay. There's for employers, there's a document that's been put out as well. Again, these are all just sort of sub flavors of the same thing that we've already been talking about. Adam mentioned this before. If the employees have symptoms, they should not come to work. That may create a challenge in terms of what sort of pay, if any, they're entitled to. If they just have symptoms and have a positive test, or they have not been exposed, the COVID sick leave would not appear to apply. It might end up applying if they test positive, or if they get an order, or an attestation is used as a proxy for an order. But other paid leave may be available to them. The New York State paid sick leave, their own vacation time, employer policies, et cetera, et cetera. And this document then also goes through the quarantine and isolation rules. It pretty much reiterates what we've already talked about. It puts a little bit different spin on it. There is an indication that employees can self-attest to quarantine or isolate. That's a move or a development that we saw really several weeks ago. We started talking about it in this webinar. It's again a function of the local departments of health in the state saying we don't have enough people to issue these orders, and so they've kind of made the orders self attesting in the sense that they'll write a letter and say that if the employee has they can certify the following things, that is the equivalent of an attestation for a quarantine or isolation order. I think that would potentially trigger several things. One of the things that's most obvious is the COVID sick leave, but there may be other things as well, anti-retaliation provisions and things like that. So the thinking, at least, is that again, we're shifting some of the responsibilities that have previously been exercised by the departments of health, local and state, to individuals and employers. Is this one mine, Adam? Yeah, it is. I apologize. The schools, and again, these are not super different in terms of the broad strokes here, but schools are not required to do contact tracing, but they should notify when close contacts occur at school. I think that's what we've been seeing all along. Again, this is, I think, trying to react in real time to circumstances. Students with presumed, students with presumed or confirmed COVID should not come to school. Fully vaccinated individuals may come to school if close contact, but asymptomatic. And this last bullet's probably of interest to some people. If you're eligible for a booster but not boosted, you cannot participate in extracurricular activities if exposed. So that may, sort of catch some people who, just got eligible for the booster or, have been reluctant to get the booster. The rules are a little bit different for in-school participation versus extracurricular activities. Okay.
All right, so we're going to do one FAQ that I know I've received or I've been asked a number of times, and that is, what is a well-fitting mask? We see that referenced throughout the guidance now, and it's actually linked in the guidance. And when you click on the link, it sends you to the CDC discussion of well-fitting masks. And the CDC just basically says, make sure your mask fits snugly, pick a mask with layers. Importantly, there's no prohibition on cloth masks in the CDC guidance. I know there was some confusion about that early on. Well, I shouldn't say early on, but in the past month or so. And, the only thing that the CDC talks about are just how the mask fits and recommendations regarding layering. So let's talk about some scenarios. What do you do if you have an employee who calls with a positive test? And what Pete and I tried to do is walk through really an action item list for all of you that we thought would be helpful. So Pete, why don't you take the first couple here?
Okay, so in all these scenarios are probably similar. They're the three that we've been talking about throughout this.
Right.
So the first one's a positive test, that you get an employee who calls with a positive test. And the action step first is to gather some information. In this case, relative to the positive test. What test was it? What type? Including how administered. Was it self-administered? Was it a testing site or a medical facility? When was it taken? When were the results received? These sorts of things will help you with the timing pieces. So those are things you're going to need to gather information. You need to determine whether the employee can work. And utilize the guidance and the flow charts and the tables provided by the state, local health department. There are some questions in the chat about which governs, and hopefully they're in agreement. and that'll make life a little bit easier. And as Adam said before, the CDC is issuing recommendations, not, imposing requirements. So it should be the state Department of Health guidance that governs, and hopefully they will be reconcilable. Obviously, if you get your local Department of Health taking a different position, you've got an option to, sort of have a discussion with them if you can reach somebody live to hopefully reconcile it. And if not, you'll have to make some sorts of decisions about how you can reconcile that. But utilize the guidance to determine, whether the employee can work. And then you also will then proceed to try and figure out, okay, if they can't work, is paid leave necessary and what type? And again, we've talked about this, but there is the New York State COVID sick leave statute, at least that's what we've been calling it, leave for quarantine or isolation triggered by a government order of quarantine, which has been interpreted now by the departments of health to include attestations. There's the New York State paid sick leave. There's the employer's paid sick leave to the extent it's different. There's other accrued time that would be available under employer policy. There's unpaid leave. So there's lots of options here with this. And Adam, while we're transitioning, I just saw it about 5 times in the chat. So the HERO Act has been extended
Yes.
through February 15th.
Correct.
That seems to be a burning question. So
Yeah, it was extended yesterday. As has been the state's unfortunate practice, they wait until just after the expiration of the HERO Act deadline to extend it again. All right, so those were the first couple of action steps. Here are some additional action steps. You have to figure out whether there are any absenteeism issues that are implicated by the call that you're getting. So is this going to count against an attendance policy? In the case of a positive test, almost certainly no, but it's something that you should consider. It becomes more important when we're talking about symptoms and or close contact. Documentation, you want to obtain proof of the positive test, or you might want to, I should say, the attestation or other documentation if it is appropriate in the circumstance. I will say that these action steps are meant to be a guide for how you proceed through the analysis and not to provide you with specific answers on how to address a specific situation. It's more of how you walk through or work through the various issues. Lastly, you have to consider return to work. Again, utilize the guidance, the flow charts and the tables provided by the state or local health departments. So that's scenario 1, when you have a positive test. And now 2, when you have close contact, it's the same questions, or the same action items, and really it's the same action items for all 3. You're just looking for different information here. So for example, you have to gather, when it's a close contact, someone calls and said, I had a close contact, gather information about the contact. When was the contact? What was the duration and extent? Generally, who was it with? Meaning you don't have to get names, but is it someone in the household? Is it someone who it's clear there was more than the 15 minutes of contact within 6 feet over the 48 hours before symptoms began? Determine whether the employee can work. And here is where a little more analysis is going to be required. We went through just a moment ago or a little while ago during the webinar what you have to do in different circumstances, who's required to quarantine. So if someone is fully vaccinated, fully boosted, they had a close contact, they don't have to quarantine. But you have to determine whether you want them to be at work or not. Again, this is the next step in the analysis. Determine whether paid leave is necessary, whether any of those categories of paid leave is appropriate that Pete was discussing. Again, absentee issues. And Pete, do you want to talk to this a little bit when you're dealing with a close contact?
Yeah, because I think this has come up, and that again, I mean, I think generally speaking, the policy and the guidance and best practice would be, we do not want people coming to work when they're sick, and we don't really want people coming to work when there's a strong potential that they could make their coworkers sick. In the close contact situation, especially now that we have looser and more decentralized contact tracing, I think there are issues with people who repeatedly indicate they may have been exposed. And this is where the absenteeism issue may come into play. That if, that these things appear to be abuse of the time and attendance system rather than, public health and employer health and employee health issues, then, your absenteeism policy is potentially back in play, at least is something you would, want to think about. But, again, these steps are the same steps. They're going to be a little bit different in this particular scenario, the proof of the positive test, the attestation, other documentation. And then we're going to try and figure out the return to work issue based upon, the guidance, the flow charts, the tables, and our fact specific analysis.
And I know we've run over a little bit. It's the same analysis really for symptomatic individuals who call in and say they're symptomatic. So, you walk through the gathering information stage, comparing the information with the guidelines, determining whether paid leave is appropriate, et cetera. So that's it for today. Thank you all for being with us. And we appreciate you joining us this Tuesday. We'll see you next week.